This is the second video in the series Citing Sources, MLA Standards and Best Practices for Quoting and Documenting Sources. This video is going to focus more on the how to get quotes into your prose. We're going to start by talking about some things that students often do that they shouldn't, and I call it quote dropping. Other professors might call it floating quotes, but I like the phrase quote dropping. This is one of the most common mistakes that beginning writers make when citing sources, failing to provide sufficient context for quotations. A quote drop is when a direct quotation appears suddenly and unexpectedly as a sentence unto itself. A dropped quotation often leaves the reader uncertain as to its purpose, since it is not connected to anything that comes before it. So take a look at this example here. The writer says, the most important feature of Wing Biddlebaum is his hands, period. And then there's a quote. It starts with the highlighted in yellow there, their restless activity, and then it ends with a parenthetical citation. In this example, the writer ends the first sentence with a period, then inserts the quotation, and most quote drops look something like this. Fortunately, the pronoun there, which I highlighted in yellow at the beginning of the quote, clearly refers to Wing Biddlebaum's hands, but the sentence before the quote doesn't say much about them, just that they're important. Well, of course they are. Quotations should always support key claims, not weak or obvious remarks like that Wing Biddlebaum's hands are important. What the writer's doing here is saying that that his hands are important, and then the quote is doing all the explanation for the writer. Instead, the writer should make a claim. A claim is a statement you make that requires evidence or examples to convince your reader. Can you think of a stronger claim to match the quote above? What makes Biddlebaum's hands important? Here's another example. This is the same weak opening sentence. The most important feature of Wing Biddlebaum is his hands. But now I have a different quote dropped behind it. So this example is even worse than the last one I showed because it is even less clear how the quotation relates to the writer's point. The passage describes what transpires between Wing Biddlebaum and George Willard, but it doesn't have that much to do with Biddlebaum's hands or what makes them important. The quote drop doesn't require the writer to give much thought to how the quotation supports his ideas. The reader will just have to guess. So this is even worse than the first example I gave you. It is also more common. Here's another kind of quote drop. The writer drops a quote, then proceeds to tell the reader what it means or why it's important, usually signaled with a phrase like the one I've highlighted there. This quote shows, or what this quote means is. You shouldn't have to explain your quotation. By the time your readers get to it, they should already know why they're reading it. So the writer started a paragraph with a quote drop, which is the worst of all. You should never start a paragraph with a quote. As a beginning writer, you should never do this. Every paragraph in your essay should begin with a claim. Remember, direct quotations support your claims. They do not make claims for you. Starting paragraphs with quotations is a good way to slip into plot summary inadvertently. So make sure that your paragraphs begin with claims that are related to your thesis, whatever that is. So there are two effective techniques to incorporate quotes seamlessly into your writing without dropping them in: attachment and integration. And actually, with attachment, there are two different forms of attachment. So there are two techniques, but three methods. So the three methods are simple attachment, complex attachment, and integration. We'll talk about each of those in a minute. But on the right here, I give you a quick illustration of both techniques using the same passages that were dropped in my examples of drop quotes before. So take a moment to read this. Pay attention to what I've highlighted in yellow there. What I've done first here, you see that colon highlighted in yellow. This is called attachment. And down here, this is called integration. Since attachment is easier to understand and use, we will start there. Like I said, there are two methods of attachment. One is called simple, and the other one is complex. When you use attachment, the method, you are usually quoting an entire sentence or consecutive sentences rather than individual words or phrases. This is very important to understand about attachment. When you're using it, you're quoting an entire sentence or perhaps 2 or 3 sentences rather than individual words or short phrases. So like I said, there are 2 different approaches, simple and complex. Simple attachment typically involves writing a short introductory phrase that links the quotation to a subject, as in these examples. As the narrator explains, the subject of the sentence is the narrator. What does the narrator do? The narrator explains, comma, and then the quotation. Here's another attached quote. According to Anderson, comma, the subject is Anderson. According to Anderson, this. Wing Biddlebaum talked much with his hands, end quote. Students ask, how often should I use simple attachment? My answer is you should probably use it the least of the 3 methods that I'm going to show you here. Simple attachment, if you do it too much, it gets a little repetitive and it seems a little lazy. The other 2 methods are much more effective. So let's talk now about complex attachment, which is better. Like I said, simple attachment is easy, but it can be redundant and seem a little lazy. Complex attachment, by contrast, requires the writer to connect the quotation to an idea, to a claim. The writer makes a claim or observation about something, then uses a quote to illustrate it. This is more effective than simple attachment because it puts the writer's ideas in front of the quote, not the source. So here is an example. I've highlighted in blue a claim that I'm making about Anderson's characters. Anderson frequently describes his characters in mysterious religious terms, and then I attach a quote that illustrates, that connects to the claim that I just made. What I highlighted in yellow there is a colon. You use the colon to attach the citation to your claim or observation. This very, very crucial punctuation mark cues the reader that there's a relationship between the quotation and the idea, between the quotation and the claim. I'll give you another example here. Wing Biddlebaum tells George Willard that he must not succumb to the limited possibilities and petty narrow-mindedness of small-town life. There's my claim, highlighted in blue. Colon in yellow, that's letting the reader know that the quote that I'm going to provide here illustrates the claim that I just made. And you'll see by reading it that there's an obvious connection there. You got to make sure when you attach quotes like this that your reader will really see that the quote illustrates the claim that you've just made. You got to make sure that that connection is really strong. Hanging quotes. This is another form of complex attachment. It's not a separate method. It's just another form of complex attachment under special circumstances. So when writing short papers, that's all you're going to write in English 1102 is short papers. It is best to avoid quoting passages that take up more than 4 consecutive lines on a page. Long quotations in prose are longer than 4 lines. Long quotations take up valuable space, that you need to present your own ideas. You know, if you're writing a short paper based on word count, and you fill the paper with long quotes that are 3, 4, 5 lines long, and you keep doing that over and over again, it's going to look like you're just filling up your word count with quotations. You want to make sure that your paper has more of your ideas in it than quotations from your sources. So most of the time, I would encourage students to trim down long quotes, and I tend to discourage beginning writers from using them. However, having said all that, there are occasions when a writer needs to include the entirety of a crucial passage. This is especially true in poetry, but it can be in prose too. So you need to know how to format long quotes. There are lots of things about long quotes, about hanging quotes, that are different from what you learned in the first video in this series. First, a long quotation, which again, in prose is a passage of more than 4 lines. In poetry, it's 4 lines or more. But in prose, it's a passage of more than 4 lines on your page. Not in the book, not in your source. More than 4 lines in your paper is always attached using complex attachment. Second, it is not enclosed in quotation marks, but formatted as a block of text that's indented 1/2 inch from the left margin of the page. This is called a hanging indent. Third, terminal punctuation now comes before the parenthetical citation, not after. The right margin and line spacing remain unchanged. It's still double spaced. The right margin is the same as the rest of the paper. The purpose of all this formatting is to make clear to the reader where a long quotation begins and ends. So let me show you an example of what you should not do first. So here the writer has a long quotation. You see where it starts, highlighted in yellow there, about 3 lines down, and then it goes and it goes and it goes. It looks like it's over 5 lines long, actually. And at the end of it, there's the closing quotation marks, but by the time the reader gets there, the reader may have forgotten that it was a quote. The reader may have forgotten it was a quote. So how should this look? So here it is properly formatted. You see that it's attached. It's attached with a colon, right? So there's an idea, a claim that the writer makes. There's the colon, and now the quote is attached to that idea. There are no quotation marks, you can see there. The whole quotation is indented 1/2 inch from the left margin. That's why they're sometimes called block quotes. I call them hanging quotes because it's a hanging indent. And then at the end, the terminal punctuation, the period, comes before the parenthetical citation, not after, which is the case when quotes are just embedded in your prose normally. So let's talk about the third method. We've talked about simple attachment. We've talked about complex attachment, shorter quotes, and then long block quotes. Now the third method is integration. And this method is what you should try to use the most when you're writing short papers, integration. What makes integration unique is that it allows you to fuse together your claim or the observation you're making with the textual evidence that supports it. And usually this is done not by quoting entire sentences, as with attached quotes, but by selecting crucial words or vivid phrases and then building a sentence around them. This creates a seamlessness that will make your prose more concise and easier to read. So here's an example of a really long quote. It's almost 4 lines long, which would require it to be a hanging quote, but not quite. And what I've highlighted in yellow are the phrases that I really liked. So I could cut the rest of that and just stick with the highlighted phrases. No complete sentences highlighted there, just phrases. So now I'm going to show you what this would look like using integration. Take a moment to read that. All of my integrated quotes are highlighted in blue. Notice how I wait until the end of the sentence to put my parenthetical citation. All of those quotes come from page 17. Now look at this one. In this example, one of the advantages of integration is that I can pull evidence from different parts of my source and put them into one sentence. So here I pull evidence from page 16, and then I pull evidence from page 17, and I combine them together in my sentence. Notice how I do need two different parenthetical citations. I got a page 16, and then the comma, and then page 17 for my second quote. If the sentence were a little shorter and there was not a comma in there, I could put the page 16 and the page 17 together in one parenthetical citation. But since it's a longer sentence and I have a comma in there, there's a pause in the middle of the sentence, I'm okay with putting a separate parenthetical citation there. Keep this in mind. We'll come back to this. Okay, the literary present tense. This is the last thing we're going to talk about in this video. In general, unless it is important for the reader to know exactly when something happened, that it happened in the past or before something else in a story, for example, you use the present tense verbs to attach quoted material. So Sherwood Anderson published Winesburg, Ohio in 1919, past tense, what Anderson did in the past. But notice here, I use the literary present tense, what Anderson says in the book. Anderson describes Wing Biddlebaum as a kind of religious figure. So notice I'm using present tense verbs. It is helpful to try to follow the same practice when describing what happens in a story, what characters say or do, even when the story is narrated in the past tense. So here I have Anderson describes the ease Wing Biddlebaum feels, right? Another present tense verb, what Wing Biddlebaum feels whenever he spends time with George Willard. Again, spend time with, present tense. So the story is actually narrated in the past tense, but I use present tense verbs to describe what characters say and do. Another way to deal with literary material in the past tense is to use integration to convert it to the present tense. So here I have a quote. It's in the past tense because, like I said, the story is told in the past tense. The two verbs I highlighted in yellow there are past tense verbs, lost and came. The present tense form, of course, is to lose and to come forth. But the story's in the past tense, so it's lost and came. But what I really want the reader to notice is what I highlighted in blue. Wing Biddlebaum's timidity, his shadowy personality, and to look at the world. So what I've done is, I'll show you in just a second, I'm going to take the highlighted blue parts and integrate them into my own sentence. Wing Biddlebaum sheds his timidity and shadowy personality. He emerges from the shell of his lonely kitchen to look at the world. So I kept all of the passages that were highlighted before, and now I've got new verbs that I used. I used the verb shed and emerge, and they are in the present tense. So I simply replaced Anderson's past tense verbs, Wing Biddlebaum lost and came forth, with he sheds and he emerges. Present tense verbs using the integration method. And that concludes the presentation on citing sources.